Welcome to episode 26 of the On the Air podcast. No, that can't be right. It's 36. I was right the first time. And we are so fortunate to be joined by one of the great voices of the National Football League, Bob Socci. It's really a pleasure to have you on, Bob. I appreciated conversing with you a little bit before we got on the air, and great to have a Super Bowl winning broadcaster with us.
Aiden, it's great to be with you. I wish I could take some credit for those Super Bowl victories for the Patriots, along for the ride, and spoiled at that, having called 4 Super Bowls and 3 wins by the Patriots, plus 2 of the great comebacks of all time in any sporting event, much less the 2 greatest comebacks in Super Bowl history. But it's great to be with you. We were chatting off air, as you mentioned, and I'm very impressed by the roll call of guests that you've had to date. So this being episode number 36, I'm very fortunate to be included at all, let alone number 36 behind some of the guests that have preceded me.
Well, I always like to start with the very beginning of your career. How did you find out that you wanted to be in the industry? I know it's kind of different for everybody. Some guys kind of figure it out in college or even later in life. But I know from listening to interviews, you were one of the guys who very early on in your life, you figured out this is what you wanted to do, right?
Absolutely. It took me a lot longer than most in my position, I think, to realize my dream, but I started dreaming of it at the age of 11 or 12. I was playing Little League Baseball in the town of Auburn, New York, which is nestled in the Finger Lakes, halfway between Syracuse and Rochester. And we had this wonderful Little League Baseball complex that included a press box and lights, which allowed the league to have doubleheaders and a public address system to announce the batters' names. And, I was a kid like perhaps yourself and so many others who were in this business, who, in addition to playing wiffle ball in the backyard or basketball, street hockey, tennis ball, you name it, whatever variety of game, I was broadcasting to my friends, if not just myself. And people who ran the Little League got caught wind of it. They saw in me this kid who wanted to be a broadcaster. And I was allowed to play games and also announce games at the same time, or at least I would play on the same night that I would announce some batters' names. We had a wonderful commissioner who ran the league, and the other volunteers as part of the Auburn Little League, again, taking an interest in the kids, not only on the field, but off, and in me in particular. They encouraged me to go up in the press box if I wasn't playing a game, could be before my game or after my game, and I sat next to the official scorekeeper, and periodically he allowed me to announce the batters' names. And so, when a batter came up, I would say, now batting, Aiden blank. Or if a foul ball was hit off to the right side out of play, I would remind the fans, this being Little League Baseball with a very small supply of baseballs, to please return all foul balls to the playing field immediately. That was my first signature line in broadcasting, so to speak, or at least into a microphone. But that's really when the dream began. And, I was one of those kids who watched games and turned the sound down, or at least had stereo broadcast. I'd listen to the broadcast and I would do it myself in the basement of our house on Swift Street in Auburn. I had my own imaginary sports network that I broadcast for, and just continued to follow that passion with a lot of encouragement through the years, beyond college and into minor league baseball and eventually college athletics and ultimately the NFL.
It's so funny that you mentioned starting with public address in Little League Baseball, because that's actually how I got my start. That is about the same way. The only difference is there was no official scorekeeper for us. I had to do the music, I had to do the scoreboard, I had to do the PA. And I'm sure there were times where the parents didn't always enjoy having to hear me, but it was a really fun way to start my career. It was kind of the first job I ever had, getting paid to do Little League Baseball public address. But it's funny that you mentioned that. I know you ended up at the University of Dayton, right, for college, and I know you chose that over Syracuse. What was the process in selecting the University of Dayton?
Yeah, it was really a process almost by default because I couldn't get into Notre Dame. Notre Dame was my dream. I had 2 dreams, primarily through my childhood. One was to be a broadcaster, and number 2, on the same par, was to go to Notre Dame. And I didn't get accepted my senior year of high school. So I visited Syracuse, which was just down the road. It made all the sense in the world for this aspiring broadcaster to go to the Newhouse School. I was accepted as an undergrad and went for my visit. And unfortunately for me and my parents at the time, it wasn't a great visit that particular day. We went to a mass open house where the Carrier Dome had its doors open, and there were, stations set up, tables, and it was kind of like a weekend event, almost like a trade show type experience for the college. And I went, and my parents sensed that I had some reservations about going there. I think it had less to do with Syracuse, frankly, than it had to do with my disappointment still at that point in time in not getting to attend the school of my dreams. And I had talked to a counselor along the way. It was ironically a counselor from another school, Boston College, who suggested that I look at the University of Dayton. And it was in the back of my mind. I honestly, I never thought there was a possibility in the world that I would wind up at UD. In fact, that year, Dayton played Villanova in the opening round of the NCAA tournament. Because I had applied, the game was on and I was watching it, rooting for Villanova. It was the year that Villanova went on to win the national championship. And the Wildcats barely got by Dayton in the opening round of the NCAA tournament. I think it was a late tip-in the final seconds. And my mother asked me, why aren't you rooting for this school that you applied to? And I said, well, I'm never going to go there. And again, I didn't get accepted at Notre Dame. We went to Syracuse. My parents sensed there were some reservations on my part. Again, less to do with SU, more about getting away from home and having a different kind of college experience. And so my father said, let's take a ride to Dayton. And we went to the University of Dayton. And from the moment I stepped out of the car and stepped foot on campus, I realized it was the right place for me for a variety of reasons. But a big part of the decision, as it turned out, because initially I thought I'll go there. I'll try to play college baseball. I'd come from a very good high school baseball program, a state champion. Maybe I can walk out of the baseball team there. And then beyond that, if I get good grades, I can transfer. Well, I got very good grades my first year. And I started the application process, not only to ND, but also Northwestern, thinking, okay, I'm going to go to a school with a more prestigious journalism program, broadcasting curriculum. But after, so many months, I decided, look, this is the place for me. And a big part of that was my involvement in the athletic department there at the University of Dayton. I didn't stick on the baseball team again. At the time, blessing in disguise. It gave me an opportunity to work in the athletic department in athletic communication, sports information. And eventually, I was an undergraduate student doing graduate student work, traveling with the women's basketball team and editing the men's basketball program and producing game notes on a weekly basis for a variety of sports teams there, which really gave me a great foundation in terms of developing my skills that would help me when it came to doing my homework as a broadcaster. And then I got an internship, in great part because of that experience with the Cincinnati Reds in their publicity department. And the Reds at the time were owned by Marge Schott, a very small front office and a thrifty operation under her control was the reality in Cincinnati. And for a kid in college, it was a great opportunity to go there, be the one assistant in the publicity department for the full-time director and the full-time assistant. So I was doing a lot of work in the press box, again, that people my age and other major league organizations didn't have the opportunity to do. And it allowed me to have a lot of interaction with the visiting broadcasters. And I learned so much from that experience, observing them, and then eventually practicing broadcasting, or at least talking into a tape recorder, trying to call play-by-play of Reds games, that, was a real springboard to becoming a professional and broadcasting minor league baseball years later. But a big part of the decision process, again, was based on the fact that I didn't get what I initially wanted. I had to, quote unquote, settle on UD, and it turned out to be one of the best things that ever happened to me.
So you're working with the Reds. Does that mean you got an opportunity to learn from one of the greats in not just baseball, but in all of sports, Marty Brennaman?
And you're right. I'm glad you mentioned all sports, because Marty Brennaman was a terrific basketball announcer, longtime voice of the ACC, did a lot of games for Raycom and Jefferson Pilot and the Atlantic Coast Conference. And of course, the great broadcaster, the Hall of Fame broadcaster of the Cincinnati Reds, working alongside Jen Uxall. And, Marty carried himself as someone who was short in stature. He's about my size, but he carried himself in such a way and conveyed and radiated so much confidence. And also, I think, really showed, this is what, being a true professional is like. Every day he would come in toting his big briefcase, one of those traveling salesman suitcases, briefcases, into the radio booth. And Marty could talk about anything besides baseball. And yet when it came to baseball, he had such a wealth of knowledge about the Reds, about the game. His opinions were strong but informed. A great describer of what was happening on the field, with a tremendous vocabulary, somebody who read a lot. So he was a great example for me in a lot of ways to observe and learn from. And it wasn't only Marty, though. It was every other broadcaster that came in, whether radio or television in the National League or the national networks. And I would stand in the back of their booth sometimes and just watch and listen and marvel at these men who were doing what I wanted to do. And at the time, it was strictly a roll call of male announcers in the National League in the late 80s. But again, having some interaction with some of them and asking questions periodically, seeing the grace in the class, for example, with which Vin Scully carried himself and how he treated people. And I think that's a big lesson too, Aiden, for me from that experience. Marty was somebody that, at times could be pretty rough around the edges to the listener. Marty didn't hold back on his opinions. And, if he believed something strongly, he wasn't going to budge from that spot on or off the air. And yet at the same time, when he was in the elevator talking to the elevator attendant, when he walked into the press box talking to Robert, who manned the press box door checking our credentials, he was so kind and so polite and so respectful. And those are things, examples that hit home for me. And I can say the same about Scully and in any number of other broadcasters that came through Riverfront Stadium at that time when I was working there.
So you mentioned how he was so great to the people around him, and that kind of segues me into the story that I had heard about how you made contact. You actually ended up getting the Patriots job, or at least getting the in there, because I can't remember whether it was in Cincinnati or in minor league baseball that you had met and kind of gotten to know the people that now founded the radio station that you do Patriots games on.
Yeah, like so much about my career, and it's a very long story, and it's involved, and it includes a lot of people. Number one, let me commend you on your homework. It's a story that I've told a few times, but not often, and I think rarely on a podcast or in any kind of an interview setting. But it's one that I've shared a lot with young people who reach out to me and ask for advice about getting into the business. And a couple of key points to be made first. I'll preface the story, the backstory to my introduction to the folks at 98.5 The Sports Hub by saying, number one, I was told at a very young age, coming out of college, one of the most important things you can do in this business is to maintain contact with the people in your network, stay in touch with people. And a longtime NBA voice told me that. And I didn't always heed those words, but I say this all the time to people: don't make the mistakes that I did. When you start cultivating contacts in our business, getting to know people, stay in touch, do it respectfully, do it politely. Don't be a nuisance, but nonetheless, maintain the relationships, devote time to your relationships with people on the air, off the air, because that's going to be so instrumental in your success, not only in terms of getting from point A, where you are today, to where you want to be tomorrow, point B, but more importantly, to being better at what we do, what we aspire to do. And so that's I think a big thing to keep in mind when I go back to the winter, I believe it was 2000. And speaking of Syracuse, a good friend of mine worked in the sports information department at Syracuse University. And I was actually calling minor league baseball at the time. And I went home over Easter weekend, which also coincided with the NCAA regionals hosted by Syracuse. Florida wound up winning that regional and going on to the Final Four. Seton Hall, I think, was one of the teams that was there. At least I recall Tommy Amaker. I think Duke was in that regional as well at the time. But one of the voices of Westwood One, who happened to be assigned to that regional, was Gary Cohn, who by that time had become one of my favorite broadcasters. I was a Mets fan growing up in Central New York, and I loved Gary in particular as a broadcaster of all sports, much like Marty, known primarily because of baseball, but exceptional at every other sport he did, including basketball on the radio. And while I was visiting my folks, I got this call from one of the SIDs at Syracuse, a friend named Pete Moore. Pete said, "Hey, we need some volunteers for the regionals this weekend. Do you want to come to the Carrier Dome and watch the games? All you have to do is check the credentials, the media passes for the members of the media walking off the court into our press room and walking from the press room back onto the basketball court." And again, something that, I was already in the business. I was cutting my teeth. I was broadcasting minor league baseball. And yet I wasn't too proud to turn it down because I thought that's going to be an awesome opportunity, number one, to watch the games, but number two, maybe I'll meet somebody. Maybe I can meet one of the national announcers or some of the writers who are assigned to covering the weekend's games. And it just so happened that Gary was there calling the Final Four for Westwood One. And it was halftime, I think, of the regional final, because it was on that Sunday. And he was coming off the court at halftime to go to the bathroom. And I stopped him and I said, "Gary," I said, "my name's Bob Soccis. I'm a huge fan of yours. I really admire your work." And he took time, with what few minutes he actually had to get to the restroom and get back to his location courtside. He took time to ask me a couple questions like, "What do you do, Bob?" And when I told him that I was the broadcaster for the Frederick Keys in the Carolina League, Gary got this look on his face like he was as excited to meet me as I was to meet him. And he said, "Listen, send me a tape. I want to hear your work." And he said, "I got to leave on a plane tomorrow morning. I'm going to Japan because the Mets are going to open the season in Japan. But send a tape to the team and they'll make sure I get it." And I did. And later that season, Scott Erickson pitched a rehab start for the Keys, the longtime major leaguer. He was down with an injury from the Orioles staff to rehab with Frederick at the Class A level. And he pitched a great game. And I thought it sounded good. There was a good crowd on hand. So I sent Gary a copy of the cassette, and he liked it so much. And although he had some very constructive criticism, he nonetheless took it to his bosses, Mark Chernoff and Eric Spitz. And that started a bit of a relationship through the years for me with them. They never hired me at FAN, which was always a place that I aspired to work. But nonetheless, they met with me and shared advice, gave me some things to think about in my own career. And I stayed in touch with them periodically. And then years later, in many stops along the way in my broadcasting journey after that, I wound up in Boston knocking on doors. And CBS Radio started an all sports FM station in Boston to try to compete with the juggernaut WEEI. 98.5 The Sports Hub was in its infancy. And Mark Chernoff and Eric Spitz from CBS Radio in New York, the men behind WFAN, were consultants. They helped the Sports Hub launch in Boston. And when I reached out to them and said, "I'm living in the area, I'd like to get to know the program director there, at least introduce myself," they broke the ice for me. Mike Thomas, the program director at 98.5 The Sports Hub in Boston in 2009, welcomed me into his office for about a half hour. He had nothing to offer me except, "We'll keep your resume and your tape on file." By then it was a CD, not an audio cassette. And luckily for me, he listened. And so did his assistant program director, Rick Radzik. And Rick remembered me years later when the Patriots job opened up. So again, I met Gary in 2000, eventually sent him an audio cassette. He passed it along to his bosses. And then in 2009, by then I'm living in Boston, knocking on doors. This All Sports launches. The program director and his assistant meet with me, in part because Mark or Eric from FAN said, "Hey, you should get to know this guy. He's a good guy, does pretty good work." We take a few minutes at least to meet him. And they did. And they listened. And then 3 years after that, in December of 2012, I got an email out of the blue from the Sports Hub because Gil Santos was retiring and they wanted to hear more of my football work.
What goes through your mind when you're having one of those conversations where you're sitting with Mark Chernoff, a guy who's so powerful in all of sports radio, specifically in the New York and Boston markets, and it's not going to be a job, but that if you do well in this interview, you're going to end up, something good could possibly come of it. What's going through your mind while you're having a conversation like that?
Well, I think the most important thing, not only in that conversation, but in every other conversation or correspondence you have with a broadcaster who is at a different level, someone who is where you want to be, the most important thing is that you should be focusing on getting better and learning. And honestly, that was my thought process the whole time. And it's always been my motivation in reaching out to people, Ed, and networking. How can I get better? Be open to the constructive criticism. Seek candid feedback. You don't benefit from someone patting you on the back and only telling you great job. Now, I've gained a lot of confidence and encouragement, and so much of it was instrumental in persevering through the long stretches when I didn't get that next job. That was extremely important. But more so was an attention to how do I get better at the craft? And I think when I was sitting down with Mark and Eric, I was open to what they had to say. I wanted to learn from them. And I can still tell you to this day some of the things they taught me, or at least they told me. And I remember Eric encouraging me, stop working for a minor league team. Try to get a job with a radio station in a big market. That's the trend these days. We're hiring people from within. Somebody does updates. Well, eventually we're going to throw him a bone and he's going to get an opportunity to do pre-game and post-game work and maybe get on the air and do play-by-play. But at that point in time, I was so far down that play-by-play path, and I wasn't in an area, although I was in Annapolis, which was my full-time residence between Baltimore and DC, I didn't have any connection to either marketplace. And I really wasn't in a spot where I felt like it was best for me to give up what I was doing and try to get my foot in the door with a station in either of those markets. But nonetheless, that was one of the things that, Eric told me years ago, because of the trend, the proliferation of 24-hour sports stations that we were starting to see at that point in time. Again, this is going back to the early 2000s, pre 9/11, in fact. And when I think back on it, there were some other things that stood out. Mark's philosophies on doing headlines and play-by-play, and the similarities of broadcasting games, and also being able to have punch and energy and concisely wrap up the headlines. And I remember at the time thinking, he's crazy. But today I reflect on it, I realize, he knew what he was talking about, obviously. Again, their words still resonate with me today, all these years later, 2 decades later.
A couple of things to ask about from that. I know you've kept a notebook of critiques and compliments that you've gotten over the years from different broadcasters. What do you learn from something like that? What are some of the things that you like that you learn? What are some of the most useful things that are in that notebook?
Oh, there are so many things that I have in that notebook. It's on a shelf a few feet away, and I could show it to you after we conclude. But or if we want to press pause now, I'll go grab it now. But I'll tell you, for an example, you had Wayne Larrivee on one of your early podcasts. And again, this is another example that I try to stress to young people. Take advantage of every opportunity you have. When I was calling Peoria Chiefs games, I need to learn to enunciate. I was calling the Peoria Chiefs in the Midwest League, and it was a fall Saturday, and the beat reporter for the Chicago Bears and the Peoria Chiefs, Phil Theobald, who was legendary in Central Illinois for a lot of different reasons. Phil didn't like to fly. Phil wanted to drive to every game that he could cover. He would go cover the Bears. He was best known, as a matter of fact, I think, in the NFL for walking out on a Mike Ditka press conference when Ditka was the coach of the Bears. Well, Phil was this curmudgeon, this caricature of an old sports writer who drove to the games rather than fly to the games and covered the Bears in the baseball offseason. And I was the voice of the Peoria Chiefs Class A affiliate of the Cubs. And Phil reached out to me at last minute's notice and said, hey, I need somebody to come to Detroit and help me get quotes after the Bears-Lions game on Sunday. Are you interested? I said, absolutely. I'd love to go to a game, an NFL game. And, if I have a press pass, maybe I can meet somebody who will be able to, help me out, or at least provide some advice. And, I took advantage of the opportunity, and I rode in this car. Phil was a chain smoker, and I do not smoke, nor do I appreciate smoke in my general vicinity, but I endured it for that Saturday and then the Sunday after the game on the way back, driving to Pontiac, Michigan, and accompanying Phil on this trip. My sole responsibility for him and the Peoria Journal-Star was to basically go to the Lions locker room, or at least help Phil in the Bears locker room, and get some quotes after the game so that he could write his game stories and additional coverage. And I did that, but I was free during the game. So what did I do? I knocked down the door of Wayne Larravee's broadcast booth in Chicago, and I introduced myself, and he said, "Come on in." And before I knew it, the engineer gave me a headset, and I was standing in the back of the booth taking notes on Wayne Larravee's spotter charts and noting how he read his introduction to the broadcast and just picked up on things, his interaction between Dick Butkus, Arkish, and I was blank on the first, Hub Arkish, who was the other color commentator, his statistician, his spotter in the booth, and just wrote down a lot of the observations that I made in this notebook that I had, and over time transcribed those into what you called my broadcasting notebook, and I actually referred to as my broadcasting Bible. And so, as an example, when I started calling college football or even high school football, I went back to the pages of that notebook, and I had written down diagrams and notes watching Wayne Larravee of how he kept track of all his information. And so I created the template that I used based on what he was using that day to call the Bears and Lions. And over the course of time, emails and letters, newspaper clippings, whatever I came across, whether it was firsthand with another broadcaster or by reading about another broadcaster, a lot of that information got highlighted, and it was cut and pasted into my notebook. And some of it is correspondence between myself and broadcasters that I now have great relationships with. Some of them are contemporaries. One of them was a predecessor, Gil Santos. I had reached out to Gil when we first moved to Boston, my wife and I, in 2008, and asked him to listen to a CD of my work from Navy football. And Gil liked it and had some encouraging things to say, also had some constructive criticism. And so I highlighted, what I felt was important in that email response, taped it into the notebook, and I still have that today.
What are some of the things that you wrote down specifically from listening to a guy like Wayne? I know, having had him on the podcast, he's one of the best technical football guys I've ever heard.
Yeah, I think the technical aspects of it are extremely important. What I think immediately captures your attention with Wayne is the voice. It's one of the classic football voices, much like Gil had here in New England. I kind of think of it as the voice of a football god, in a way, a football broadcasting god. It's like the perfect voice for calling football, particularly in the case of Wayne, Midwestern football, Big Ten football, where he started at the University of Iowa, and then, of course, moving on to Kansas City, and then Chicago, now Green Bay. But it goes beyond the voice. It's the delivery that captures all the key elements. He sets the table. He provides the formation, the description of what's about to take place, covering all the nuts and bolts from the technical aspect, as sound as it gets. And then when the play unfolds, rainbows down the right side, the tail of the tandem and setting up the I formation in the backfield. But the rainbow down the right side is pass, and you picture this high arching throw from Aaron Rodgers down the right sideline to Devontae Adams. The terminology that he uses, the knowledge of football that he possesses, the relationship that he has with his partner on color commentary. All those things stand out, and all of them stood out to me when he was doing the Bears game. Now, I think that the Packers broadcast is as good as there is in the NFL. One of the dangers, though, I think, of listening to Wayne is trying to be like Wayne, because he has such a rapid fire delivery. He's like Kevin Harlan too. He doesn't slip up. You've heard me have to correct myself, stumbling over my words and pronunciations, probably a dozen times already in this brief interview. Wayne calls football at this breakneck speed flawlessly. But again, it's mostly the technical stuff that I really try to learn from and take away from. And I think it's the knowledge and the enthusiasm related to both teams. It's not just the Packers. When you're listening to Wayne Larravee call a great play from the other team, even though he's the voice of Green Bay, nonetheless, that play is exciting. And that play, he's not taking that play off because it didn't go well for the team that he's broadcasting for.
You mentioned rainbows. Do you have any other favorite describing verbs that you like to use on a broadcast that you picked up?
We try to develop your own, but I think you want them to come organically. I'm sure there are some that I have that I incorporate. Hopefully they don't become crutches. I think that's always a danger in our business, particularly if you have signatures that you use, whether it's a home run call or a particular call on a running play or a passing play. I think the challenge for me when I go into the broadcast booth is to try to call the same thing over and over again in a different way. And one of the good, honestly, one of the good experiences of my career, and it was a long one, 16 years of it, to prepare me for what I hope to do each Sunday in calling the Patriots games along those lines, was the experience I had at Navy, because the Naval Academy ran the triple option my entire broadcasting career there. And there were times, Aiden, where they didn't even attempt a pass. I mean, I called games with no pass attempts, and it was always the triple option. So how do you say, fake to the fullback, quarterback, keeps it on the option right, pitches it or keeps it himself, and say that 60, 70 times a game and not make it, monotonous, make it interesting for the listener. And I think that experience helped me in trying to, set the formations and use different terminology today. I think a big thing that I try to take away from broadcasters, because I often get myself in trouble with the number of words that I use and not being as concise and tight as I should be, is trying to self-edit after I listen to other broadcasters. There's so many great ones in our business. And I think that we're in a period now that, ironically, though most of today's broadcasters grew up on television first and then radio, contrary to years ago. When I started, of course, the typical path for a lot of the people in television had been cut their teeth in radio, work in radio for a long time, and then transition to TV. That was true for Al Michaels. It was true for some of the other network stars at the time. Well, today, of course, most announcers, most people even my age, grew up watching games on television before they began listening to them on the radio. But I think we're in a period now where there's so many great radio broadcasters, and there's such attention to detail, painting the picture, that more than anything, I try to pick up on varying the vocabulary and the terminology, but even more than that, doing it in a more concise, tighter way, a more digestible way for the listener.
It's actually interesting you mentioned that. I've never really thought of that before, but it's something that I've always tried to do when I can do a radio call as opposed to the TV call. I usually enjoy doing the radio more, if only for selfish reasons. I get to make myself better. But I mean, is that something that has helped you a lot? I know you've done very minimal TV in your career, a little bit with college basketball, but for the most part, it's been radio in minor league baseball, radio with Navy, radio with the Patriots. Has that really helped you? Has that made you a better broadcaster than if you had done TV on ESPN for 25 years?
Well, I can't say that firsthand. I think that, there are many examples of people who did it the other way. I mentioned Al Michaels. You think about some of the legends in our business, even going back to my youth, Kurt Gowdy, again, longtime radio broadcaster, eventually became the voice of network sports at NBC. And there are many others like him. And I think, again, that was generally the path of people in the past. And I don't want to slight anybody who started out in television and worked in television for 20, 30 years, or today, as a young broadcaster in his 20s or her 20s, calling television play-by-play. I think they're challenging their own way. And there is a certain gratification level that you get from radio, from my experience, that I don't get from television. But, the same could be true for the television broadcaster out there who doesn't get that same sense of reward and accomplishment in the radio booth as opposed to the television booth. So I think it's all, it's all dependent upon your personal experience and personal preference. But I do think that in my case, I love radio. I love the blank canvas. Scully, who's the best ever, in my opinion, at any sport, but particularly as a baseball broadcaster, has set himself apart from so many legends. I mean, he's in a universe of his own. I mean, there are the Jack Bucks and the Harry Careys, but there's Vince Scully, in my opinion, is alone in our profession, much maybe the way that Doc Emmerich could be viewed today as a hockey broadcaster in relation or in comparison to his peers. But Scully, like so many other things, phrased it best when he said, in radio you have a blank canvas, television you're writing the captions. We just got off the preseason schedule. We just completed 3 telecasts, during the preseason, as Patriots broadcasters now, Scott Zolak and I, broadcast to a TV audience, and that game is simulcast on the radio. And my fear in the television booth is that somebody's tuning in on radio and saying, why doesn't this idiot give the down and distance? And he hasn't said the score in 20 minutes, much less the time. What's wrong with this guy? Because it's not a broadcast meant for radio. And in fact, our telecast for the Patriots preseason games is even more atypical of your common television broadcast. We spend a lot more time storytelling and conversing about storylines related to the team, competition battles, et cetera. But I walk out of the booth after one of those games and I enjoy it. And, it's certainly new in a lot of respects compared to what I'm accustomed to and what I'm most comfortable with. But it's not the same feeling as being spent after a radio broadcast when you really pour your heart and soul into it. And you feel like, you've gone in there with your palette and your toolbox and all your preparation. And even if you only use a small amount of that preparation, nonetheless, like you feel like you have completed something, that, like I said, was a blank canvas, and you painted the picture as well as you could, and hopefully you painted it well. If beauty is in the eye of a beholder, hopefully the listener, felt like if you didn't say, give him a masterpiece or her a masterpiece, you at least, gave them a complete picture of what happened on that Sunday afternoon. And I feel like that gratification exists in the radio booth for me calling the Patriots. Has it helped me in television? I think in some ways I'm still inexperienced enough in television, though, that I think that it hurts me in some ways too, Aiden, because I'm still thinking about saying too much, not saying enough. Where's that balance? Where's that comfort zone? And I think that at times I hold back even too much. You have to say less on television, but I think sometimes I'm so cognizant of it. I'm not comfortable. I'm not relaxed. I'm not confident in my television work related to my radio broadcasts. And therefore, maybe I'm not saying enough, strange as that seems.
Do you miss doing the regular schedule of television games?
Well, funny thing is, I do miss it at times. A friend of mine who's made that transition from great radio play-by-play broadcaster to outstanding television announcer has said, your heart is in radio, but the money's in television. We were talking about ESPN too, and you asked me about the broadcasters today who call games on ESPN. I think one of the great things about people like Adam Amin, who is now with Fox, of course, but had been with ESPN, and Jason Benetti, and some of the other outstanding talents from ESPN, Fox Sports. I think you could certainly include Joe Davis in this mix, and some of the other people of their ilk and their generation. They get to do radio too, in a lot of cases, if not all cases. So I think they really get to enjoy the best of both worlds, and they're outstanding at it. Adam in particular and Jason are two guys that I've really respected and admired as I've gotten to know them.
You mentioned earlier the slip ups that you've kind of had over the years, and how you kind of never have a perfect broadcast. And I've heard you talk in interviews about the need to have a perfect audition tape, and how there's been times where you felt like you have to have a perfect audition tape. Get it right there. And I can tell you, I've been through that. I know, I'm sure just about every broadcaster has been through that, where they're really like, they're setting your mind when you're going into an inning thinking, all right, this is the inning. We're going to clip it for a demo. No mistakes. Everything's got to be perfect. What problems do you see with that? And how did you as a broadcaster move further and further away from needing to have the A+ clean inning or quarter of demo?
Yeah, I think it was detrimental for a long period of time, putting a lot of pressure on myself to try to find that perfect tape. I would suffer paralysis by analysis listening to tapes. And often they would pile up at the end of the season. I didn't devote the time during the season, for example, to try to stay ahead of it. And often in the minor leagues, particularly the lower levels of the minor leagues, the conditions just aren't ripe for it necessarily. Small crowd, maybe a long game where the pitcher's struggling to find the strike zone. There isn't a rhythm to it. I think sometimes your best work doesn't sound the best because of what you had to do to get through the game and try to make it as interesting as possible. But that doesn't necessarily make it good to the ears of a decision maker, who's listening to the next broadcaster he or she wants to hire. So in my case, I used to fret over what to put on an audition tape, whether I should put too much emphasis on a stumble here, a slip up there. Was it important to be perfect? Was it important to be flawless? Was it important to sound relatable, to be an easy listen, to sound personable? Did you want to have humor in it? Did you want to show some personality? Did you want to show how much homework you did? And when I found at Aiden, I was often broadcasting to try to produce an audition tape as opposed to broadcasting to tell the story the best way possible, the best way I could on that given night. And again, it goes back to focus, as you were asking me earlier about what are you thinking when you're sitting down talking to potential decision makers or talking to other broadcasters that you reach out to. Your mind has to be right. And I think your motivation has to be true. And so if you're broadcasting and you're worried about, hey, there's a good crowd tonight, this is good ambiance, I need to have the perfect tape. And you're thinking about like 2/3 of the way through an inning, this could be the one. And then you slip up and you're crushed because you've made the mistake and you're thinking, okay, this isn't going to be my audition inning. Well, you still have to finish that inning. You've lost focus on what should be your concentration. And so I think it could be detrimental. And I put so much pressure on myself through the years. And I think also it affected my broadcasting style. There were times, and I got called out on this by a couple of announcers in the big leagues periodically, where I was broadcasting to try to impress someone who might be listening as a decision maker for a potential job opening, as opposed to trying to tell the story to a listener. You and me, it's my job to tell you what's happening, what I'm seeing on the field, and to do it in a conversant way, again, that makes me relatable to you and likable to you. And so I was thinking about things that were out of my control, and therefore they were affecting what was under my control. And I think, I stress that to young people all the time today. The pressure that you can put on yourself to get the perfect audition tape can be immense. Don't let that affect what you're supposed to be focused on. Unfortunately for me, it did for far too long. Interestingly, in my case, I think there were personal things that happened in my life that started to change the focus. And eventually too, and what I found is that not that I tried or cared less, but when I started worrying less and caring less about what the next job was going to be, I realized a lot of improvement in my work. And I think that was instrumental in helping me to develop the kind of sound that seemed, appropriate for an NFL broadcaster in the ears of the listeners at 985 The Sports Hub. And I go back to conversations I had with people in the business that had listened to my work, some of them themselves decision makers. There was a broadcast executive for one of the national radio networks who talked to me about my style on the air. And he said, you don't sound like an NFL guy. You sound like a college guy. And I struggle. What does that mean? What does an NFL announcer sound like? And I think over the course of time, when I became more relaxed and I started broadcasting the Navy games in a more relaxed way, in a more confident way, because of, the different satisfaction and gratification in my life outside of the broadcast booth, and also not worrying about where am I going to be after Navy? What's my next job going to be? I'm just going to enjoy this opportunity because life is good right now. And it's okay to be the voice of the midshipman. Just do good work, broadcast to have good work out there. Then I think it made a difference. And maybe I captured that NFL sound. At least I did to the program director and the people involved in the Patriots decision eventually, but it took a lot of time.
So you mentioned the stuff going on in your personal life. I know you moved up to Boston when you were still doing some stuff with the Tides and you were still working with Navy. How difficult was that to balance the enjoying the moving to Boston and at the same time and having to deal with everything moving up there, and at the same time you're commuting down to Maryland? I've made the drive from not Boston but close to Boston to Baltimore. It's a tough drive. How difficult was that to balance your schedule when you first moved up there?
Yeah, and to give the listener an idea of what the road had been like to that point, I broadcast minor league baseball out of college a year removed from graduating from Dayton with the Rochester Red Wings in the International League. I was Josh Lewin's assistant, home game partner, along with a lot of other things that I did for the team for a couple of years, and got a chance to cut my teeth in play-by-play. But then I went out to Peoria, Illinois, and I broadcast in the Midwest League for 3 years. And then I landed a job on the Eastern Shore of Maryland in the South Atlantic League with the Delmarva Shorebirds. And at that point in time, started calling Navy games, first as a backup fill-in, and eventually as the full-time voice of Navy football and basketball. And during that period of time, dating from 1996 through the early 2000s, I was broadcasting Delmarva and then switched over to the Frederick Keys because it was closer to my home in Annapolis. And then I started calling AAA games eventually in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the summer. So I would uproot in March, drive across the country, do the PCL games for the Albuquerque Isotopes, head back to Maryland and broadcast Navy football, and then get into freelance college basketball by that time for Navy's conference, the Patriot League. And then after 3 seasons in Albuquerque, I had the chance to go work for the Norfolk Tides AAA team in the International League, same ownership group, a little bit closer to home, still a 4.5-hour drive from Annapolis. So I lived this kind of nomadic, peripatetic life where I was always uprooting. Maybe I had a full-time residence eventually in Annapolis, but every season I was on the go one way or the other, either headed out to a minor league baseball destination, to live for the season, or coming back on weekends, or, getting ready for the college basketball season and traveling a lot on weekends during the college basketball campaigns. So that was the lifestyle I led. So for me, it really wasn't that difficult from the standpoint of, okay, I'm going to be traveling back and forth between Baltimore and Boston. What ended up happening is I met my wife, who at the time was finishing her education in Baltimore. She was from Boston. Now, I had felt like I was making progress on the air, but I wasn't really advancing in my career. I was happy at Navy, but I was also at AAA. I called the Isotopes. I'd called Norfolk. I felt like I was ready for that next step to the major leagues, but it wasn't happening. I wasn't getting really opportunities outside of the Patriot League as a freelancer, calling college basketball or other sports on regional or network cable. And so she asked me when we got engaged, do you mind if I put some feelers out with recruiters in the Boston area? We wanted to have a family. We wanted to raise kids near grandparents. And I always wanted to live in either Boston or New York. So it didn't make any sense for us at that point in time to move near my parents in upstate New York. As you can probably hear my kids now fighting and screaming in the background. We ended up moving eventually to Boston, where her family was and where her dream job was. She was offered a dream job right away. It didn't take her long to reach that goal. And so I reached out to Navy and I said, I'm thinking of relocating to Boston, but I'd like to continue to do the games. And I was lucky that they said, yeah, if you can get yourself here, you can call the games. We'll set you up with a rental car. We'll set you up with a place to stay if you need it, but you get yourself to the games and we want you to continue to be our broadcaster. And that's what happened, Aiden. I should pause this and tell my kids I'm on the air as they're fighting downstairs. Hopefully my wife has has her hands on the controls down there. But that was, I was in a great spot because Navy was willing to let me do it. And again, I'd always wanted to live and work in New York or Boston. I felt like I was kind of on a treadmill where I was in Annapolis. And so that forced me to go to Boston and start knocking on doors, which led to the aforementioned opportunity to meet the folks at 985 The Sports Hub.
So while we're on the topic of your kids and they're in the background, I'm always curious, and I've always wanted to ask some of the guys that have done this with families, how difficult has it been to raise a family and at the same time do games? And do you think it's easier for you do you enjoy it more being home basically most of the week during the days and then you miss 1-2 days on the weekend? Is that how have you balanced that over the years?
Yeah, I'm fortunate in that, we live a lifestyle where my wife has a career and it's good enough for her that we can both kind of enjoy not only full and vibrant careers, but also, have a quality of life at home. Again, despite the ruckus in the background. Hopefully that's not coming over too loud. You can see my face, how red it is right now. But when I think about my situation, again, I realize how fortunate I am. Now, there are a lot of broadcasters that are able to juggle all the balls in the air and do so admirably, professionally, but also as parents and as spouses. And there's so many people who are able to keep far busier schedules than I do and maintain a great balance and get the rewards, but also give back in other areas too, community, family, et cetera. But what I found from my experience is that I've been very fortunate. The NFL does allow a quality of life. I can be home for dinner just about every night of the week. And when you travel, you're gone basically a day and a half, 2 days. If you're traveling with a team, which is the case for us most of the time. This year's an exception because of COVID. We're not traveling with the Patriots on their charter. We're flying commercially. But again, typically the road trips are not long and taxing. You're talking about 8 games during the regular season, 9 games now with a 17-game schedule potentially. But this year the Patriots play 8 road games during the regular season. They're broken up so that you're not on a 4-game road trip out on the West Coast the way a basketball, hockey, or baseball announcer might be. I found when I broadcast baseball, even at the AAA level, I was gone from mid to late afternoon until midnight. So even when you're home, you're not really home a whole lot. So for me, this has really been an ideal situation personally and professionally. Now, does it affect your work? In some ways, yes, because it cuts into the time that you have devoting, the extra hour or two to tape study, film study. You might have to cut back a little bit on your reading because you might have to go down and break up this horrific sounding argument in the kitchen right now between two siblings who are fighting over controls to the remote or whatever it might be. But at the same time, I find that, I have a fresher attitude. I have a greater appreciation. I try to you learn to make the most of the time that you have. It really forces you to be better organized and have a better command of your schedule and to try to accomplish the same when it comes to your preparation for the games, but to do it in a more efficient manner.
Before we get to the final questions that I get everybody out on, I'm curious, what does your week look like in terms of schedule with prepping for a Sunday NFL game? We'll keep it Sunday because for the most part, that's when the games would be, but I'm sure it changed a little bit when it's a Monday or Thursday.
Yeah, and again, this time that we're talking right now is a little abnormal because of the lack of accessibility that we have, a reduced number of media availabilities related to the team, so there's less contact. But in a typical season, it really goes from one week to the next, and then it repeats itself the following week, the week after that, the week after that. So for me, it really starts the preparation for the next game as soon as that day's game ends. You go down to the press conferences or the locker room and eavesdrop, ask some questions, take note of what's being said about the game you just called. And then when I get home or when I get on the plane, if we're traveling, and I open up my laptop, open up the game book, the stats, the box score, play-by-play from the game I just called, I start recapping and then looking ahead. And so what I'll do, Aiden, is the night of a game and, the immediate aftermath of a game, I'll start highlighting the play-by-play and kind of matching it up with my memory of the broadcast. What are some of the important plays? What are some of the important developments, stats to take away from that game that are going to be important to build on this next week ahead? Same thing with the Patriots' upcoming opponent. You watch the highlights of the games that day on Football Night in America or Prime Time or one of the recap shows. So you have a feeling for what's happened in the league. What are the storylines? If I call an early game and I get home in time, and by late afternoon, I'm sitting in front of the TV for the fourth quarter of the 4:00 game or the 4:25 game, or I'm sitting down with a laptop out watching Sunday Night Football, and at the same time starting to scour the internet, trying to read a little bit about the Patriots game, the coverage of the Patriots game, but also the opponent they're going to play the following week. And then as the week goes on, each day you develop your preparation in stages. At least I do. Try to get my spotter charts, the template for the spotter charts, done Monday or Tuesday, so that I have all the information ready to go, or at least I have a place for all the information I'm going to accumulate over the course of the week, ready to go and lay out in preparation for the game. I do a lot on computer. So I try to have that template done early in the week. And then as the week goes on, I'm reading newspaper stories, going online, try to sift through the information, going to the player availabilities in the locker room, open locker room, 45 minutes a day. I'm hopping on the conference calls with the coaches early in the week. I'm watching video of the upcoming opponent. I try to watch the network television copy rather than the coach's copy, because I often feel like I get more out of that from my standpoint. You can hear what the broadcasters are talking about. You get a sense of what was stressed, emphasized during their production meetings preceding the game. So it gives you, an idea of what some of the storylines may be, for that particular team. And so as the week goes on, I'm accumulating all this information, but at the same time, I'm also entering it into this template that I've created with my spotter charts. And everybody has a different way of creating their spotter charts. Some people do it by hand on a manila folder. Others do it on computer. I do it on computer and then tape my sheets that are printed off the computer printer onto this poster board. So it's got the Patriots offense versus the Dolphins defense on one side. You flip it over and it's got, the Dolphins offense versus the Patriots defense on the other side. And again, as the week goes in, I'm filling in all those blanks and I'm trying to do it in a relevant way. Like, as I prepare for this game, I don't need to know what Tua Tagovailoa did his junior year at Alabama. Maybe the sense of him coming off the bench in the national championship game and throwing the game-winning touchdown against Georgia. That's good to have at my disposal. But it's really more about, okay, what's different about Tua this year than when we saw him last year in Week 15? What's relevant about this Dolphins team compared to the one that beat the Patriots late in the season last year? What are some of the key storylines surrounding this Dolphins team going into the game? Free agency. What are the series relevant notes and anecdotes that I can have at the ready just in case I need them on Sunday? And then when I go into the broadcast booth, just quickly to wrap up a long-winded response to your question, I really try to bear down during player warmups. I refresh my notes. I highlight and add to them during the week, especially in the hours leading up to kickoff. But then when we get into the broadcast booth on game day and the teams come out and they start going through their warmups, I'm immediately locked in with the binoculars, trying to identify those players, looking at my charts so that when the game starts, I don't have to look at my charts to identify them. Some of the identification you get from television, some of it you get just because you're familiar with the players, who they are. Some of them are stars in the NFL. But I want to make sure that when I'm calling the game live, that I'm not looking down at my charts, searching for a number, that I've watched those players go through warmups. And I've even started to broadcast in my head, throw down the right sideline. Parker reels it in at the 25, to the 20, to the 15, to the 10, et cetera, as he's completing that rep in a warm-up drill.
Final questions that I ask everybody, the new one that we've started asking: what is the one thing that you have to have for a broadcast? Piece of information. I think last week Matt LePay said it was his cough drops. What is the one thing that you can't do without on a broadcast?
I'm going to sound like a shameless shill. I'm going to say my Bigelow tea. Bigelow tea is a proud sponsor of the Patriots radio network, and I do enjoy Bigelow tea, but it's tea and honey. If we're somewhere where they don't have tea in the press box or hot water at our avail, I'm kind of lost. And I understand where Matt is coming from here. And often too, broadcasting in the minor leagues, of course, you don't have that luxury, particularly in the South and on hot days. But I've become so reliant on tea and honey during the games. It's kind of like your security blanket. It's like Linus's blanket. I think more than anything, whatever it does for my voice and my throat during the game, it does far more for my mindset and my comfort level, just to know that I've got that cup of tea there alongside. That's number one. And I would say that the binoculars that I use, again, having called Navy in the triple option, I developed a need for binoculars because I'd have to keep them focused on the quarterback fullback mesh, that near exchange or exchange of the football, when it came to the first option and the triple option. And so I've become so accustomed to it when I'm calling the Patriots. If I've misplaced my binoculars, I'm in a panic. A couple of years ago, my binoculars broke. They got slammed down on the counter. They fell off the counter and they broke. And I use these wide angle binoculars, which are really tough to find these days. They're usually out of stock and take a long time to get in stock. So I'm very particular about those, but more so, I would say it's the cup of hot tea and honey.
Broadcaster that you've always wanted to meet, dead or alive, and I know you've gotten to meet so many great ones. It's probably hard to choose.
I'd say Mike Emmerich, because I haven't met him yet. He's somebody that I truly admire on and off the air, and I have a lot of friends who call hockey, including the radio voice of the Bruins, Judd Surratt, who's a close friend of Mike Emmerich. So I've constantly asked Judd, hey, the next time I'm in the building, I got to meet him. But of course, Mike is now retired, and I just finished reading his autobiography, so I haven't been able to touch base with him personally. But I feel like I do know so much about him. I had the pleasure of meeting Scully, again, a great role model for broadcasters on and off the air in so many different ways. And some of the legendary voices of the past. I certainly would love to go back into time and hear what they had to say about calling games in their eras. I feel like I've read enough about the business, and I've always tried to be a student of our craft. And I have such an appreciation for the old time broadcasters, but men like Red Barber, Russ Hodges, the great baseball announcers of their time, themselves included. Marty Glickman would be another, of course, of the legendary track and field athlete from Syracuse, who was a mentor to so many great broadcasters, particularly, an icon in New York and so influential for people from New York. I've gotten to meet Kenny Albert, though I haven't met Marv Albert yet, but certainly when it comes to iconic figures with a wide influence over people in different generations. He's someone you can hear the Marv effect, influence on so many broadcasters out of New York City. Mike Breen is another that I really admire and respect his work on the air, the way he carries himself off the air. So I've named a bunch. All those guys are people that I really have a lot of respect and admiration for.
Favorite stadium or arena and away city that you get to broadcast games from?
My favorite stadium to this point, having called games in most of the NFL stadiums, is Lambeau Field, for obvious reasons. The history that resides there, and the sense that you get. It's like walking into old Yankee Stadium. And I think about it, or Wrigley Field or Fenway Park, the great iconic venues in sports. And I think Lambeau Field, when you go there, the fact that you're staying in Appleton and you're driving through the countryside and you're going into this residential area, and there's so many fans that are out there, and they're out there so early, and there's a beautiful Hall of Fame where the history is captured. I love that experience, love the history of sports, the history of football in particular, and just the sense that you get from being in a stadium like that. It's reminiscent in a lot of ways of Notre Dame too, for obvious reasons, because of the influence one had on the other. Pittsburgh, I love being in Pittsburgh, calling a game at Heinz Field. Again, the fan base is phenomenal. The city comes to life. The backdrop with the confluence of the three rivers and the city of Pittsburgh in the background as you're looking out at Heinz Field. Seeing so many in black and gold with the terrible towels in the streets, walking over the pedestrian bridges on the way to the stadium. It's an unbelievable environment. I love broadcasting games there as well.
Advice to younger sports broadcasters that ask you just in general, what is your career advice for them? My primary pieces of advice are get reps, experience as much as you can. Always concentrate on being better at the craft. Use that as your motivation, not only in doing your homework, but also in reaching out to contacts and people in the business. I think this is a business that is largely reliant in terms of moving up and career success in terms of getting that next job and reaching the big leagues at the network level. It's predicated on relationships. But again, I think your motivation in developing those relationships has to be true. And I think that most important of all is that you reach out with a desire to get better. Be open to constructive criticism, seek constructive criticism, be enthusiastic. Marty Brennaman, kind of to end where we started, a great piece of advice he told me. And I think that this is held true for so many announcers. And it's part of the legendary story of how Scully got his opportunity with Red Barber and the Dodgers.
Don't complain. Nobody wants to hear you complain. Be enthusiastic. The greatest quality you can have is enthusiasm. And it was Barber who was listening to young Scully in terrible conditions, inclement weather, try to broadcast a college football game, I think from a top Fenway Park in horrible conditions. Scully never mentioned the conditions. And Barber was so taken by that, so impressed by that, that he was willing to give Scully an opportunity, or at least it heavily influenced his decision to give Scully that opportunity in Brooklyn. So to me, that's so important. The listener doesn't care how tired you are. The listener doesn't care how boring the game is in your mind. It's your job to make it interesting. You're being paid to be there to broadcast that game. You're cold, so what? The person who might be listening in a toll booth or on a truck or on a work site, they're dealing with a lot harsher elements than you are. The fans that have paid good money to be in those seats in front of your broadcast booth and are dealing with the wind chill. They don't want to hear you talk about how cold it is where you're sitting. Again, be enthusiastic, appreciate it. Don't take anything for granted.
If people want to find you online, see what you're up to, listen to a Patriots game, where can they do that?
Well, they can listen to the Patriots, of course, on 98.5 The Sports Hub in Boston and our network of stations, primarily in New England, but we have a few outside of the New England area. New York, we even had a station in Alabama that carried our games. Last year in Auburn, Alabama, I don't know if they're going to continue to carry the games, but maybe Tuscaloosa will pick us up now that Mac Jones is the Patriots quarterback. But, beyond the traditional means, obviously there are outlets like NFL Game Pass. I don't know if iTunes is still available, but different apps. 98.5 The Sports Hub has an app as well. There's subscriptions, Sirius XM satellite radio, on which you can listen to the Patriots game broadcasts. Beyond that, I'm heard on 98.5 The Sports Hub, 98.5thesportshub.com. Do a podcast in the off season for our station, available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. I'm on Twitter at Bob Socci, and that's SOCCI. And I guess there are probably a few other places I show up, but those are primarily the places you can hear and find me.
Bob, appreciate you joining us. This was one of my favorite conversations we've done. Every week I feel like I'm saying that, but this week was really one of my favorites. And best of luck starting. This was the first weekend. This past weekend was the last weekend until I think the middle of February that we're not going to have NFL football. So that's always a good thing. Started college last weekend, and now we get to start the NFL. And appreciate you joining us. Best of luck in the next season.
No, I really appreciate it. This is a great way to start it too. I really appreciate your interest and your willingness to learn. You're already off to a great start to your career. I wish you all the best and look forward to hearing and seeing your work for many years to come.
Appreciate it, Bob. We'll see everybody next week.